this computer.
So would it be like, let's read it from a crossbreeder perspective, and so the crossbreeders just like sort of takes different bits and mix them, or let's read it from the perspective of another card and there's another approach to reading the same thing?
You're asking Leo right now.
I think so, yeah. Is it what
Yeah,
you were
that's
saying?
yeah, that's actually so we've been exploring that with the filters, right? I think and like how the cards can also be filters. But yeah, it's been interesting, like trying to, and this is just in terms of like one of the possible approaches to the thing, but been trying to like make some card code stuff. And the question is like, how do you stylize it, right? How do you render it? And what is the view? And so I'm looking at like the interface, like the big interface of the thing is a card. And then as you click a card, you've got a new card. And that is the point of view through which the cards that are nested within it are stylized, right? So it's like everything that is inside is stylized through the lens of the card that you are currently is in view, right? So I think there might be
like a cascading nesting effect.
Yeah, and it's cool too because there's the possibility of like generative styling, where does the view listen does the cards that are nested tell the view this is how I want to be viewed, right? Or these are some ways that you can view me, and then the view has a function that can interpret that and then views it in a certain way. Can there be a back and forth dialogue between the world and the, between the card and the view? Is this generative? So it's been getting, at least at that, it's going to be beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah, there is some interesting takes, even in the physical world. Like there are card games that use the transparent folio approach, that they have an element and then I mean, there are not too many that kind of use the folio as filter. I cannot think of one, like that the card would be see-through, but a certain way, like simple way would be a red folio, but something else. But of course, that's not the limitation in digital realm. But it's interesting to think what kind of utilizations of this kind of thing is in existence and how forms could be stolen out of those.
I have very sorry, this is kind of tech side note. I have very big initially tried to explore this kind of overlay, how to, like, I know this from school books, when kind of solutions were hidden in some print and then you had to put the red foil on and then you can read those. Pablo, did I not show you this kind of spatial library website thingy?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, it never came to really functioning. I use it then a bit differently, but maybe I can just, if you want to, was it not this? But yeah, I should just check if it's the right thing that I'm sending. Yeah, it is.
Spatial library sounds interesting.
I don't know, is that clickable for you? No.
I mean, one can, copy it or.
Yeah. And then if you kind of drag the menu, then you can kind of see what the thing could do. But anyway, that was. I just wanted to say that I think this optical overlay, this visual overlay, it's just, I think it's a really sweet measure.
Yeah, from transparency to other effects. And thank God the web has at least some blend mobs, even though it should have more. But that's me. The one practical question I could ask, like, of course, for Linda, if you want to present some question, but also for Rock, if you have some question or area you would like to ask in terms of whether it's what's been happening lately or anything else, that might be a good way of bringing finalizations towards this transition.
Yeah, it's nice to see you guys. Yeah,
Likewise.
I'm sort of in the middle of work, so I sort of was meaning to listen in and kind of catch up through that. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't have any questions right now. But I did, yeah, just come out of the CC hub in Austria. And yeah, I guess I'll see some of you in May as well there in the later event.
Yes, yes, we've been talking actually about how many of us, but some of us will definitely be there.
Mm.
And let's see what will be the constellation.
Okay, carry on.
And listening is completely valid, even though many of the messages want to push people to be proactive for reasons, but listening is always allowed. And Linda, did you have any other question?
I feel like I'll definitely want to watch the recording of the last one, to see what cards you brought in and what was this sort of more abstract approach. I'm quite curious, but I don't want to spend any time in just going through it because it's pointless, because I should just watch the recording, really.
Yeah, the last session actually has a decent also starting point. It starts from, like, Pablo was the first one who introduced the card, so it really starts from that, because it was, do you say?
No, please.
And this is partly because it was the first ever XORG recording video that has been edited, because I had to edit it together. So I actually kind of put it somewhat sensible as a starting.
By the way, I tried, I showed two other people the exercise that Pablo had made, that was like a very meditative approach to like trying to create a card or around your environment, and they loved it. And I was so great. It's just wonderful.
Oh my God, I can't wait now. I'm so curious. I'll definitely watch that over the weekend.
Yes, so that's like, I'm not promising, by the way, that I will edit the videos, because it's an extra with already kind of sometimes complicated pushing the recordings. But now that it was necessary, I at least.
Why? Because of Jitsi having limited time?
Yeah, it kind of dropped in the middle, and I had
yeah.
to restart the recording, so I glued them together and did some extra editing on the side.
Yeah.
So that was the reason. But all right, shall we transition out of transition?
Yeah.
So let's see. I can at least introduce the challenge, and then you can either accept it or not, or do whatever you want with it. I'm, like I said, I think it could be a design challenge, but we'll see what happens. But I wanted to kind of premise this with some description from the last week, actually, mostly, that comes from me, like, playtesting Oxels in a very hacky, drafty format. But I got them, let's say, to a state that I think that they were reflecting as a playtest towards how they could perform or behave even in a more more finalized or developed format. So, and I want to kind of describe this. There is an interesting quality there that I want to highlight. So it seems to me that if you were to have a extensive sense of these oxels and you could play with them, you would have multiple possibilities created. That there is a very quirky, kind of phantasmal, but still a clockwork heart in the middle of the play of oxel. And that, yes, might sound slightly mysterious, but I'll try to open that a bit. So what I mean by this is, like, when one creates this, let's say, situations forms that are kind of like cultural, but they don't exist, there's always a kind of hallucinatory quality to them. Like the process seems weird and woozy, like where are we kind of thing, which you're probably familiar in the XORGian realms at points. And there is a general tendency to this sort of hallucinatory quality that it's kind of ephemeral. It fades away once the moment is over. And I think the main reason for that is really, it's depending on the whole process to be, like the whole mental process to exist. Like your mind state at currently when you're playing is needed for you to play. And given how memory works for humans, it doesn't actually record quote unquote processes. So it's very hard to kind of keep the state, quality, atmosphere, a way of process alive. But what was interesting once I started introducing this kind of oxels is that they were pointing that they were behaving a little bit like structures, ledge points to stand on, which created this effect that while the moment could be quite hallucinatory, it had something to hold on to. And while that might sound abstract, I can make a comparison that this is kind of how concepts are also. That, like, in a way, how concept works, like in a word form, for example, is that it is really like a seed for hallucination, given the context, because you have to kind of start from what it has, but then make it to the context itself. But the fact that there are these words and there's this whole framework of language gives you this stability to retain something of the hallucinations in itself. And there was a similar quality to this. Not to the same extent, but that's mostly because we work so much in our human lives on language. So to turn this to a bit more concrete, any questions at this point? I was hoping for some, but I'll jump anyway to an example. Okay, one more short point, and then I jump to an example of the quality of play or the style of play. And there also seems to be this like a question of the mindset, of what is the mindset of the player, which could be also slightly mysteriously put as forms of culture that generally don't exist now potentially exist. And what I mean by that is, like, somehow our minds like seem to work, and this became evident also in the play, that normally it's like when you think of possibilities, you start to kind of think about what there is. It's like, oh, I could make food. What do I have? Oh, and the mindset, which was actually like getting a grasp of that mindset was very helpful for me for actually starting to play. Here was more like, rather than thinking that, okay, this doesn't exist, which mentally led to kind of just walking elsewhere, somewhere that it does exist, was starting from this, like, no, actually, like something that does not exist is just as well a starting point. And now I'll be practical. So I was in a cafe and I had a pen and paper. So I thought of the idea of drawing, which certainly as a loose concept exists. And as a first thing, I thought of like I put a couple of senseless, non-meaningful marks, like a dot and a line on the paper. And then that created this idea of, let's call it speculative symbolism. And this like came kind of formed as an idea of like culture where you draw something and like, even however small, and then you think that as a symbol already. Like, what does it symbolize? And then you kind of loop that might create an idea that, okay, there is a dot and a line. So maybe the dot is like a weak center and the line is a line of escape. And you might continue with still minimal drawing to add with the idea in mind. So you're moving into this like symbol that does not exist. And at the same time, you're treating this, given the mindset, as like, you're thinking like if you're playing in a world where people could be doing this, maybe not every day, but there could be people that are doing it here and there, just like people do, you know, portrait sketches or whatever. And it was interesting how well it started working to kind of carve out these areas that I never thought of that. And from here, I can give you an example. So to create a kind of a bridge, I also picked like, how could you take existing like symbols as raw material, but treat them in this manner, which would mean that your mindset is again that the symbol is not set in stone, but it's actually always like a growth point, that you expect growth from it. And now you will see a very quirky piece of paper, which is highly blown up from the original size, which is not too large, and slightly blurry, which I so are you seeing the image, by the way?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So I took the material. I took the question of this, the mark of the question, or the symbol of the question, and then just started like really first without thought, like drawing well like this, in a way drawing wrongly, and that and this, but then treating each one, okay, this is a different type of a question mark. And I can point like a couple of things, highlight, it doesn't have to be this large. I'll put it in the center. So for example, I don't know if you see my cursor, maybe not, maybe yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we do.
So there is like, for example, two versions that are kind of mirrors. So this one is like a question cut from the middle and mirrored around that. But on the other hand, this 8 here on the right side, I guess, for you, is also a mirror in a way, like in the other way. And then like having drawn them, all their mirrors, so what is a mirror question mark? And this created this first idea was, oh, it's a convention where you're making a question that expects as a response a question. That's an easy answer, but it's already a different, you can like suddenly this sort of cultural pathway that doesn't exist starts to kind of sketch itself out, like a sketch drawing of culture.
This is so
So-
cool.
Wait till you see where it goes, because it, okay, I'll leave it to later, because it starts to travel a lot, which is interesting, highly interesting. So, but then I thought, okay, that's possible, like question that expects a question in response, but what do you do with that form? And that then created this form that it could also be, and maybe the two different types respond to this. It could be a question, like two questions, where this sign is in the middle. So you have some question, this sign, and another question, and they set a query bracket, that there are two questions existing, and where you're thinking is the middle ground of the two questions, which was highly interesting because I haven't really faced that kind of an expression form, semantic form in itself. Like, what is questions as a bracket? And it does work, but it like makes you think differently already. So having drawn like super loosely couple of sketches and taken like maybe 2 minutes thinking, I was elsewhere, culturally speaking. Okay, so then another example. Then in the kind of left middle, there is this column of serpentine forms, which just came from this idea of, well, question mark is sort of serpentine, so what about, you know, I turn it to more serpentine? But that opened up this, so okay, what if I would make a serpentine question? Well, then it's actually not just question and an answer and stop there, but maybe it's expecting a certain kind of like continuation. And then the easy but interesting solution was that it's actually a question, it's a dialectic question, like those that are not familiar, like the Greek tradition of dialectics is this sort of like how you use this sort of question and response kind of in how the response is kind of like query in itself and forms another response, and you're essentially oscillating through, and that in itself is development. Dialectic in a sense of bouncing between two sides, very roughly speaking. So making a serpentine question is expecting a serpentine path, which is sort of dialectic path. So then that opens this interesting possibility, another cultural pathway where there's actually a kind of like expectation of dialectic openings inside of an expression. That I had some drafty thoughts where that goes, but I'll keep this short. So I'll stop that there. But it's a horizon in itself. But then on the extreme left, there is like the two short, like, well, loops, really, which then, of course, easily came as a thought of, well, that's a question as a loop. So what it expects is actually, one form could be that it's not expecting to exhaust itself when it has a response, but whenever it's responded, it returns to the beginning and continues to question the question. So, which is an interesting structure and workable. And of course, you could then think, well, maybe it also has an exit condition, but it's not necessarily exiting, but it's looping. So the question continues even with responses. So that's the loop question. And all of this has taken now maybe 10 minutes. There is others, like in the lower right, not quite at the end, but there's actually versions of the different bracket forms, like the normal bracket and the square bracket and the whatever it's called, the kind of curly bracket. Can't remember the name of it. Which then open up this idea that actually it's a nested question, which sets up a question, say, in the middle of a text, to kind of dig something under and leave a question as a seed, which then continues whenever you're continuing to read the text, but the question remains like digged under. Or you could also think of it hovering over, like a light that continues to affect the text afterwards. And maybe I'll pick from the extreme middle this very curlicue thing, which was actually just an example because it was the idea of an expressive question, like in the style of expressionism, that once you write a question, then you draw the question mark that you think reflects the question itself and its qualities. So in a way, like a miniature artwork, but reflecting the kind of way your mental state of question that you're in. Now, one highlight from this, there could be other examples, but I'll stop there. There's the labyrinthian things and so on. But I'll highlight here, like going back to this, for example, this mirrored question, opening the sort of question brackets or questions answered with questions, or the loop, opening this culture of setting loop questions and so on. Like this, I would highlight the kind of potential that it's kind of already taking you there. It's like, culturally speaking, you're not in the existing landscape, but you kind of make a sketch drawing and then you step into the sketch drawing, culturally speaking. And mentally, it feels like that you feel like you're stepping as an amateur to something that could exist, and you're kind of figuring out, like, okay, loop questions, could this be a loop question? And so on and so forth. But it's also because it like makes you organize your state, mental state, but of course it could be action in some other context as well, because I mean, action derives from what you're thinking, starts to perform differently. But there is another thing I want to show you, and this is kind of the last, but actually any questions at this point, then I'll show you one last thing, and then we can stop this premising.
Just a comment that this is amazing. Like, I really like the opening up question mark as a design space and affecting, of course, questions as a design space. Like, that's great. I'm wondering if we could think of a way of adding this kind of thing to the ambiguity expression markup language, or to the Oxel expression markup language. It's not so much related to ambiguity, so I guess it's more like a precision, but it's really, yeah, it's really incredible.
I agree. I love how you sort of, you create more expressive forms that follow. I mean, of course, we all know that there's this sort of, there might be different type of questioning, but then obviously there's one symbol for it. But by you creating more symbols, then you can almost get a typologies of questions. Yes. That then match. Like, as soon as I saw the labyrinth one, I immediately thought about, you know, that there's people that before asking a question ask you, can I ask you a question? Like, that's the labyrinth. So, you know, it's like, can I ask you a question? And then you ask the question, and then you get deeper into the question. So that's the first thing that I thought about. So it's like, it's really nice how by expanding the symbol, you then immediately think about how the practice of questioning can be declined into different forms. So it becomes really expansive then.
It's really opening the sort of, it essentially opens this edit mode on conventions. And I'm using conventions here in the most widest sense, like in a way like that we have a concept is a convention. We conventionalize a behavior that this is what I should think when I see this concept. And of course, we know from concepts that if somebody creates a new concept, then we learn it, then our thinking might change a bit, like, oh, now I actually think this through this other concept, and now my thoughts are more clear. But conventions are not just words. Conventions can be even like patterns of movement, or how do you do toothbrushing is a convention, like anything really. So, but this is like edit mode to that. Like suddenly, no, like you can edit that, and then it opens up, like starts to open up this, like how this new convention could exist, which then is not just that new thing, but kind of opens this pathway of development. Like what if you had like whatever of these serpentine questions, mirror questions, or loop questions, with this sort of what kind of behavior it creates and what if others would follow it, which is of course now you start to see the oxel underneath. Like, first of all, the speculative symbolism was already an oxel, and I started actually describing it shortly, like having drafty versions of having that behavior. But then all of these things in themselves could be oxels, which have a fairly open, like, you can have the symbol, you can have examples of how to do it, examples of practical use, and that in itself is creating this oxel for somebody to play and invite others to play them, and then they are in a cultural pocket which can thread out.
What I think is interesting is you're doing this in the space of kind of, let's say, typography, or rather, well, letter forms, even those are not letters. How do you say that, Pablo? Characters?
I guess this is calligraphy. Yeah, I don't
But
know.
I want to specifically say that, I mean, in glyphs, let's say, we're doing this in glyphs, right? And I think one thing that is really interesting is that we have a phonetic alphabet, so the characters we have at hand don't mean anything. But the punctuation we have at hand, they are semiotic.
Mhm.
They say something. So, like, the first idea was that, like, I've been just recently, again, because it's one of my kind of deep fetishes, like looking into type design software. It's just that I don't have a Mac, and I would love to run glyphs, but I can't run glyphs. But so, like, thinking about Font Lab again or whatever. But like, the I think one of the nice things that have come around through through chatting on the phone has been an expressive exploration of punctuation. That's completely happening, like, and I think it's so enjoyable, and I was just thinking, like, it could be even like an XORGian kind of micro product to come out with a whole, like a font where you include your basic characters, but you fill up the whole glyph chart with just amazing punctuation symbols that can all work in a font, and we could all play those, or, like, I mean, anybody could use that. It's just a kind of like an expressive thing, and whether or not the kind of reconventionalization or the conventionalization anew of those would occur or not would basically not be of our issue, because it's a proposition. So
Yes.
it would just, you would just kind of, there would be a cast. This would be a cast. This would be a toss, basically. And I think that's really nice. The other thing that came around my head was that, in this sense, you're also kind of, if you keep this kind of line drawn between semiotic forms, like forms that mean something because of the kind of convention that is linked with the symbol, and those that don't, you're kind of also walking the line between, like, a score and a libretto, right? The libretto being made from phonetic letters, and the score being made of semiotic signs. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, you're going into, like, keys and pause signs. I mean, you're not doing that, but, like, this is all hovering in that same space. So I think this is going to a very kind of musical edge of typography, in a way, by way of kind of focusing on not the letters, but the punctuation forms. So
But even picking from your example or case now, the score and the libretto,
yeah.
like, this opens another pocket which is nested. It's potential infinity, as these are, which is like, what if you start writing text that it always is in the form of a score and a libretto, that you always write notes of process, which are semiotic symbols of some kind above the text, like you have in a libretto. What kind of writing that creates? Now that pocket is huge, and the key thing really is this combining like, of course, in this case, there is a kind of sensible graphical form. Some forms might not have that, they might have other things, but it's always combining that with the actual practice, the operation. Because like giving this as a drawing, people say, oh, cool or not cool drawing, and so on. But it's this like, oh, this mirrored question has this kind of behavior, which makes it now a semiotic, new semiotic sign, which then proposes this culture, like that combination.
Well, but in a way, the operations that you go through, they lean on pre-existing meaning and pre-existing form, and they transform the pre-existing meaning by transforming somewhat analogously the pre-existing form. So there's also a type of metaphorics going on in there. So so that there are spaces opened for reconventionalization, but they're not like, they might offer themselves, they might not offer themselves. So it's, I think also if I just, because I was thinking so we have a colon, or we have an ellipsis, or we have, semicolon and all those type of things. And if you just, push them a bit higher off the baseline, or you make a triplet, or you make a quadruple, or you make whatever, or you kind of stretch it super long and make just a few spots, they will not lose their reference, but they will kind of musically rearrange speed or slowness or sound or silence or this type of thing. So I think, sorry, I'm basically, I lost a bit my thread, but I just kept talking. So I hope it still makes sense.
Yeah.
But I hope you remember, Pekko, why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Yeah, like, I mean, this was intentional. Like I said in the beginning, this was intentionally me picking like an existing symbol form.
Yeah.
But I can say that wasn't necessary. Like I don't want to keep this long, so I don't, like, there were a couple of other examples where I actually started just from like dots and something else, and they opened up completely different spaces. And of course, I'm not saying that not deriving anything from culture, but there's very much a degree. Like sometimes you can go very close and just make one variation, or you could just take a little bit from existing conventions and create a lot. Like that space is completely open. And I would stress that this is a small pocket in an infinity. Like yes, we can do this, but I'm stressing out that this was the 10-20 minutes one direction, but at the same time there was this like infinity. If I would have gone to another direction, completely different pocket, like even now the combining liberator and score as an expression and figuring out different ways of making score, which is not like height of notes but something else, but about the process, that's a whole space different from this, but it's still a pocket in this infinity. But there's like there's an interesting other effect I want to highlight, which was I returned like on the next day just to kind of visit this topic. And what I noticed that something had developed in my mind that I comprehended question differently. I'll give you an example of this because it's a very small thing, but it's kind of wild. So I thought that, okay, equations. Leo certainly knows about equations. We have this left-hand side and right-hand side, X operation this, U results in U, like a basic mathematical equation, but we have many equations in and of themselves. So then for some reason I came to this thought that, okay, what if the medium of the equation is not equality, but query? And it's hard to explain this, but this sort of works. I have a lot of material. I made this sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek, but slightly seriously, that this is the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and in the middle there is a form of a question which is actually the bridging element rather than equation. So I called this, let me check my notes, that this is equations of functions in the medium of general query. So I'll go through this practically so you get how this works. And it's very sketchy, but it works, which is very interesting. So to simplify things, the supra how could be thought that supra is the prefix and the how is now the, like, it's just supra how. But what is supra? Well, supra is the previous, is the thing before, essentially, supra ampere. So then for me, the supra how turned into that it's the operation where you're in a moment and you think of what is the previous moment to this moment, which could be, of course, many, many things, but you pick something, which is the equation's left-hand side. And on the equation's right-hand side, which is more resulting, it's almost like the response side talking, is first of all a loop, which is that it's looking for a loop structure. Then there is, which would be normally a line of division, but then sketching together, I call this a line of analytic division, that you essentially look at something and take it into parts, and that can happen in many ways. And underneath there is, once again, to simplify, a natal prefix y. So natal y would be the incepting, birthing y. And this is all through what I, not to get too complicated with it, maybe I'll go through the practical more. So what I ultimately came up with how to use this equation was that I'm in a moment. I find a moment previous, the supra how side of it, and I query it through, like, seeing it as a loop, and then break it down into the incepting, birthing y's. And like, it's hard to explain because I'm kind of bringing you like in a fast forward way, but because my mind has changed in a question, this seemed like, I wouldn't say normal, but something that seemed like plausible. And I spent like an hour creating different stuff from these kinds of things, like that this in itself worked. Like, oh, okay, this is how I look at the thing. Like, I'm looking at the previous, then I think of it as a loop, like that I just come from the previous moment, like for example, a coffee cup was on the table. I'm currently drinking from a coffee cup. The previous is the coffee cup on the table. I think about it as a loop. And then I think about the how of it is like, okay, it's the racing, while in the loop, when I turn this how of me racing it into a loop, I'm using this loop, me raising the coffee cup, raising it again, into the query of the natal y, which I'm analytically taking this part in. This is very weird, but it works, and it's also.
I love it. That's
And
one.
it's such a small thing, and it does a lot of things in a very weird way that makes you think in a way that just doesn't exist. And I just, like, this was the trouble. Like, I think there was a reason why this happened the next day. It was that there was this effect of actually starting to break down the question in itself, and then the mind was kind of generalizing from that. Oh, okay, because it's now different, it starts to mean different things. And what about it as the medium of processing? Of course, that makes sense. And then, like, equations is one way to create processing, like algorithmization. But then you turn it into an algorithms that are not so much about exact results, but actually like states of query. And I wanted to bring all this weirdness as a highlight of how it not only kind of creates new conventions, but once you then step into those conventions, they start to expand the space, and you end up in just exotic places. And still, we are in a pocket. We're in a pocket where like, oh, I guess I have speculative drawing, speculative symbols as a drawing form. Oh, I guess I start from questions. Oh, I guess there are now new forms of questions. And now I'm in a, like, making questions as equations as processing units that are completely new or just different from anything I've seen before. Yeah, that's my premise of what is the kind of potential effect of oxelized culture.
So this is freaking dope. I absolutely love it. There's like a lot of stuff that comes to mind. I think of yeah, I think so. On the one hand, right, like there's the whole the movement of the question, like on the question thing alone, right? There's like the way in which assigned design leads to a certain, guides you through certain paths through operations. Because what at least what I see in this equation is a bunch of sign designs that are suggestive or can be interpreted in different ways as guiding one through a series of operations. And so that is absolutely wonderful. I love it. And yeah, it brings back when I was in college before I dropped out. I wrote this paper. No, not a paper, like thing for the exam, right? I sent it over to Pecco, and I think something, but it was about like the movement of questions through themselves, as like how that has evolved through philosophy, right? Like how does a question go through a certain frame? Does it question the frame as it is going through it? And then the paper ended up getting towards like and it stopped right at this well, then what is a materialist question? And it would be one in which, or like after Hegel or whatever, and it would be one that understands itself as a questioning immanently anchored in relations, that understands the questioning itself as doing that and going through a frame. And so I stopped there with that, and like this is so wonderful because I feel like it really gets to the heart of that is this is looking at questions in a way that views them as you're doing the questioning, you are imminently understanding that your questioning is rooted in relations, right?
Yes.
Going through frames, right? So like this, what you're performing here is like is exploring the space of what materialist questioning, well, materialist like in super large, I mean that's even a terrible word, sense in ways that I don't think, yeah, it's just beautiful. I think it's great, and it's just wonderful.
Yeah, and it's weird, like for me, like I said, like it it hasn't completely naturalized, but it's made a boatload of way towards being kind of like a form that is usable and understandable. Like in a way, this is the question. Like it's the little question machine generator that goes to. It's a way to query, but it's also detailed in multiple operations that have a high relation with each other. So like it, but it's really as this example of like how much there is power to culture once you start to recompose it.
Mhm.
Because this is what this is like. It starts from the simplest thing, like draw the question mark differently, but then turn that into different behavior operation. Then that operation starts to teach you, or those operations start to teach you to think about the whole thing differently, and suddenly you're in a different place. It starts to iterate and develop from the iterations. Yeah, it is rather something. Any other comments, questions, whatever isms?
Part of part of me is thinking about how the experience of drawing the question mark, right, was reflecting, like, as you were moving your pen, right? Oh, my laptop's about to die. As you were moving the pen, right, how are you perceiving it? And then I'm thinking about how that goes into like interface, and yeah, I don't know. I got to get my laptop charged.
Yeah. I also hope that the kind of equation query nature came through for others. I know Leon might be more living in that culture a bit more, but I don't know about the others who might be or might not be. But hopefully it was at least understandable on some level.
It's not directly related to the equation, but I think or what becomes really apparent to me is that all of these opening up the question comes from recognizing the question's organizing capacity, like how a question organizes language or structure or a conversation. And by recognizing that it has a specific way of doing that, you can have other specific ways of doing similar things, and then just translate those other specificities, in this case, to a different drawing of the question mark. So, I mean, it is a very XORGian thing to recognize the organized principle of something. And that is where the edit button on conventions come from, right? From recognizing that and opening it up, basically.
Yeah.
So it's just a very, I'm trying to generalize this operation that you did with the question and the question mark, and try to figure out if that is the generalizing operation. Sort of like, okay, this is an organizing principle. How can we open it up, right? And that just, yeah, that is massive. Like you can basically do this exercise with any convention, right? I think questions are a particularly fruitful one because they have a very simple interaction and we're used to it. So it's really, yeah, it's a great example. But really, you can do this with everything.
Yes, I can kind of confirm that, like having tried other things as well. Like the one thing I could say, like something like it's like mining, like some things seem more fertile than others. But generally you can compose everything that is in a convention manner, and it also like it takes you into very different places. Like just to use an example, this Martins, like if they're, you know, you would read a book and there was always a score line, but the score wasn't like putting like how high you should say a word, but like way of processing. If one would spend a couple of days on that, like you probably would create like a completely different way of thinking about text in itself. And that would be a very different area in itself. But you could pick something that is less semiotic suddenly, and because like I said, like we are able to create something like waving hello or reading a word called loop and thinking in a certain way from the same premises, like from the same operations, like they're all kind of conventionalization of like thinking patternization, whether they are happening in words or physical or any form. So in principle, yes, I agree with Pablo. This applies to anything.
There was so I've been trying to recently code with the cards, and I'm not saying code cards, I'm saying like code code cards using cards that are print like on the table and just like moving those things around. And just like chaining the operations to try to find like what are combinations that are like the most, I don't know, like what are certain patterns in like the chains of operations that allow you to express as much as you can. And yeah, like I don't know, but during that process, one of the cards, right, then we've been talking about this was like metaphor. And so, you know, I start take the metaphor card and just start putting it on different things in like in the house, like putting it on a person, right? And saying that this is a metaphor for something else, making it in relation to, you know, different things in the space, making like a filter, a metaphor for something. I don't know. And then I was holding the card. This is like total, this is not really, this is somewhat related, I guess, but yeah, I was holding the card and then I'm like, wait a second, I'm a metaphor.
Yes, the
I
eye.
was like, and so is everything I'm doing,
Yeah.
right? Like, and so that just blew my mind, right? Like, and I started dancing with the card and I was like, every one of my dance moves is a metaphor for something. And then the act of trying to, like, there's this interplay between that which I am expressing through the dance and then that which is actually, like, the simplest thing is that the dancing is a metaphor for how I feel. But then you can get more wild. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's really tangentially related, but I've been really enjoying. All I could say is I've been enjoying all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, it is really like, I think oneself I is a metaphor in multiple senses, and it's a constant metaphor in some ways, like always like deriving from a fragmented context, like a metaphor is fragmented out of the conventional meaning, and therefore you have to create the process. I mean, in many ways, I is that. But I wanted to like, so like these were kind of practical examples. There would be others. I don't have material, and I want to kind of keep this not running too long, but I'll just like bullet pointedly tell that I also tried other directions. One of them was like approaching mapping differently. And one of the, once again, pockets in there was actually looking at images normal images as maps, and kind of figuring out the, so you kind of like you're looking at an image, like I should have something on the screen for this, but these are not probably the best candidates, because the best candidates would be, let me think, like I'll scroll out of this, not these guys.
That, like, the logo you have for your .ping files are like, what?
Yeah, that's the, oh yeah, that's the weird sadness you get from having the great program of earphone view, which is um a really good program, but it tends to have weird logos like this. So but I'm just picking now randomly. Let's pick this one. So like if I see this as a map, I could think like immediately, like the easy one is like, okay, there's foliage here. I'm kind of like, first I saw it not as a separate tree, but actually something growing from the frames. So now I'm seeing a garden, but then the garden shape is weird, because now I'm looking at from the sky upwards to this arch, and then like, and then is that like a dead sculpted garden next to it, like above it, like, so there's a living garden and a sculpted garden of forms, which then has an even more weirder sculpted garden, and like then that opens up this whole, okay, a culture where people take snippets or full pictures and kind of form a map out of it. I was of course thinking of gaming culture that constantly generates maps and so on. So this is just to kind of give this bullet point the example of how do you then, that culture points into quite different directions, but suddenly opens up a lot of possibilities, and kind of twists now the visual language in a new way. But with all of that premising, I kind of want to pose this challenge of expressing this, utilizing all the learnings from the card form, including the last session, the kind of how it opened the card form, like how those two things could combine. And I do think they benefit from being thought together, especially towards the expression of it. Just as a kind of material point, when I started playing around with expressing these things, what became quite apparent is like there's not really like this is the right form kind of way. Like even for this speculative symbols drawing, I wanted to write like, here are simple kind of operation of how to do it, like this operation of like draw something minimal and then stop and take the speculative view and see it as a sign, then use that to draw a little more and then speculate again, and like a small change, but that in itself significantly changes the process in itself. But then immediately with that, I thought, well, this is useful, but it's even more useful if there is like somebody creates examples of the speculative symbols they created, because that complements the understanding. And then one can think of any other kind of material that kind of starts to populate the space of what is speculative symbols as a kind of cultural practice. So that was like clearly where things were pointing out, but that's something just to put on the table towards this question of challenge, like if the oxel behaves like this, and I do think the kind of developed oxel would behave like this, and the cards are how we think about them in a wide fashion, are a way of expression, how they could express or be used to express the sort of card formations towards the oxel. That as a design challenge. if you accept the challenge, you can also modify this to go into some other direction, as you have that power. But
this to me feels almost like not the reverse necessarily, but quite of a symmetrical approach to the sort of more designing the symbol and the questions, because the sort of richness of the narration here, it's quite evident. Like, it's such a rich image. Everything is like, it just gives me so many different inputs and potential narratives, that it's almost then mapping it, you sort of do, almost feels like an opposite process compared to the previous one of then drawing and finding the lines and getting the narration. This is almost like the vice versa process, because from the richness of many narration, you then find the points in the line, the map, sort of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and it's also learning this sort of practices, like you're saying, you're completely right that here, I mean, this was the example of the mapping and improvised on the spot, but in most of the times, it actually, that culture, this sort of seeing any images or environments, by the way, as maps, enjoys rich sources, like with a lot of sources, and then wants to cut down. Whereas the symbol was actually starting from the minimal and then wants to grow more detail. And so there are these sort of hidden practices, best practices kind of things in oxelized operations.
So there is so there's quite a bit of overlap here with some things I'm trying to explore.
Stop sharing, like to clean the palette a bit, like we can pick other material. What do you say?
Yeah, could I share a screen actually? This would be
sure.
I might have a little surprise.
Let me. I have to probably. Where was it again? I've done this. I have to just. Oh yeah, the participants is the list I'm looking for. Yes, now you should have rights to closure.
Okay. Up. Up. Oh. So, okay. Yo, check this. We've got some cards that we can compose. And navigate through the nested cards that are inside of them.
Yeah, that is interesting.
And like, yeah, but this is not very beautiful, right? And so a conversation I was having with a guy last night was regarding this, looking at the cards as paintings, and that like something that I think Kandinsky was saying, but probably other people too, right? Was that like painting as a form is so good in its ability to show everything at once, right? Which is kind of what's happening here with the cards that are nested in each other. We're seeing the whole graph in one moment, right? But so then the question is like, how are we seeing? And so also to the point, Pego, you were making about like looking at the images as a map, here, every single thing, everything is actually here we've got different types of keys that allow us to traverse further down this map graph. And so here we've got like the number is the key, which has a map, which has two things inside of it of different keys, which themselves are keys which have a map with a function inside of it, which has a map with an input. And so you could interpret this to be able to compose the elements in whatever way you would like. Or I could compose I could have like functions within functions, and I could compose the graph forward or backwards or in whatever way. But then the question comes, right, in regards to if we look at if we look at the painting as a card, right, and it is also a map, right? So, and each of the, not just for the sake of saying it, right, like just for the sake of like simplicity, let's say every color here is another card that is nested within this card, right? So it's literally exactly this, except in the sense that it's nested, except that instead now, how am I visualizing or interpreting this structure into a certain visual form? And so, yeah, like, yeah, at least so then we were talking about how we were talking about at the beginning of the call here about like how the view acts as a interpretation of the thing that of the things that are nested inside of it, right? So if I could have, for example, one card, like this input string that is in multiple places, and yet from different points of view, it is stylized in different ways, and it could contain information about its style, right? Like we could put a style inside of this function and then interpret that in order to visualize or audioize or whatever, like, or is it free floating, right? Like right now it's like a grid situation. Right now it's a grid situation, but right, like, is it relative? Is there a relation between objects? Like, how do I, right now, the entire page is a map. This is actually, the entire page here is a map full of cards. And when you click a card, my view is different, as in there are different cards now in my view. So it's like, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so like, what if, then the question, yeah, I guess I'm just going on a rant here, but, but yeah, that's the,
Yeah, let me
Yeah.
propose something to kind of bring this also towards this potential challenge of how do we could use cards towards this sort of oxels. And I kind of maybe I kind of sketch out the kind of middle point, which is like towards this kind of a range of possibilities, but like also slightly more concrete, even. So it's limited, but it's kind of like halfway to this kind of direction. So think of this generally. Like, so let's say there was this sort of, there was an oxel of speculative symbols. And in a way, somebody created like a way of describing the operation of doing them, which is not the way of describing just one way. And in a way that can be a card itself. And of course, like there could also be these examples, and let's say among them there is this sort of question. And in a way, like there could be these pictures, and like it could be like each one of these sort of question marks could be a card in itself, but then it kind of clearly becomes maybe almost like a natural pressure that grows into its own area. So the simplest way, which is not like far enough, but it's a way to walk forward, is to think like, in a way, every card is a deck and every deck is a card. It's like, oh, actually now, yes, this way of making question marks is inside the speculative symbolism, but it's a deck in itself which then starts to collect things into it, and then grows to, for example, using these question marks, and then like this form of question of equation is born there, and that's inside of there, but it's its own deck as well, because it can grow like into a huge size. And of course, this is stretching a bit like the deck in itself, but it's kind of drawing very sketchily about the structure of how things are nested always within each other, and then can always open those nests to be like pocket infinities, essentially. So like that's a very crude way, but still like a way that takes a bit towards structuring in that manner. It's missing a lot of parts, but it's also like has some of this element. Like it can naturally could serve something like how speculative symbolism suddenly creates its own island that also becomes independent, forms a deck like the question marks, which then develop the equations and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
I guess that's a bit kind of what I was saying, that you later rephrased as patternizing, like recognizing the pattern that this creates. Like in this case, it's like the question marks and the whole set of operations that enables.
Yeah, and it also contains, like, still in a rough way with this possibility, is that one card, quotation marks, could be in multiple decks, like maybe the question mark created is in this deck where people are throwing in this sort of different new semiotics of the question, but then the question, particular question mark goes to the equations and becomes very important there. It's in both places, in a way.
Yeah, it's I'm thinking about, at least in the case of the question, right? Like if we've got a question card, right, that has a certain style to it, then within the current view that we're in, we could interpret that style card and its relationship to the rest of the map in order to understand what path we take or what operations to execute.
Yeah, the form you presented has this map quality, which the deck normally doesn't have, although it could have, but this sort of quality, it's not just like a passive collection, but it's laid out in a particular manner. Who dropped? Oh, Pablo dropped. But I think one can kind of maybe address this in parts. Like I'll take another example, still using this sort of very crude but maybe functional deck metaphor. Let's say these questions and question forms are developing. Somebody starts from kind of elsewhere and makes an oxel of and then includes this, let's call them figural questions. It's not a good name, but something. So it takes all of that, but it also includes other things that come from completely elsewhere towards the question. So it's kind of like a new deck in a way. So, but it becomes this sort of collection, a way to understand the question differently, that they collect from different oxels. Is that understandable? Like somebody like, oh, there's these interesting things, like here are these sort of figure out question marks, but there's also something else happening in somewhere else. I'll make an oxel of question. I collect all of these together, and that becomes a new starting point, which includes, for example, all these question marks, but probably some other stuff from other branches of development.
I gotta admit, I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, so let's try to be very practical. Let's say, like, there's sort of, let's call them figure out question marks. There's this direction that was open up, this drawing of different questions that keeps on developing. So there, people develop new things for it, but there are also somewhere else something that hasn't been described, something else interesting happening with the question. Maybe somebody comes up with physical questions, I don't know. And that entices somebody else to form an oxel called question. And they take these figural questions, that branch, into that deck, so to speak, of the question, but they also take these physical questions and some other things. So they collect the deck, which is like a new configuration now, which is about like question itself. And like I said, this every deck is a card and every card is a deck is a very rough way, but it kind of like draws very rough lines into this kind of possibilities. Like it's sensible to see that I'm seeing these interesting developments with this figural questions and how they lead to different kinds of approaching questions, and also this sort of question equations. But I'm also seeing somewhere else people making physical questions, which is movements and whatever. I make an oxel called question, and I put these all together, which is then a new context, new configuration, new collection, in a way.
What is the difference between an oxel and a card?
Well, like there is Venn diagram-ish overlap, but well, let's say the oxel is not so formally tied, which is plus and a minus, as is a card. Like the card still comes from and should come from somehow the idea of the formalism of the card. Whereas oxel starts from this idea of like how culture is all organization, and even a simple description can entail a whole reorganization of culture. Like this classic example of, like, if I create a short text that describes reading as a form of puzzle solving, utilizing text, and then I start developing different ways of puzzle solving, I reorganized every text in the world. And I can be in that oxel, which is kind of a representation of like cultural pocket you take, but I can also invite others there. So it's a form precisely towards the kind of tendencies we have been processing today. So it's not so much how it looks, which is an important element in the card, but it's more about what it does.
Okay, so Pablo's demonstration was, it's like a space that opens up the oxel, but that can be put in other, I don't know.
So I see card is a particular oxel, as like oxel understood as organizational element, and then has its own characteristics, right? Like the card has this modular thing, it's equally important to any other card, so that's the card as an oxel. And then we've been using cards to host oxels, to have a plethora of oxels live within this card format, so that we can play oxels in an easy way. So it's a difficult relation, but I guess that's how I see it.
So like Oxel is like kind of like the what we were referring to when we talk about like the platonic idea of a card, while like the card is just like an easy way to manipulate. It's just like an actual card is just an easy way of doing manipulation.
Yeah, like a good vehicle for game-like operations, I guess.
Got you.
And
Mm.
this is
But
the
I mean, sorry.
do say, do say.
Yeah, I might have some background noise here, but like the way I understood Oxel is that any part, for example, of the card could be an Oxel. Like, so I could use, if I say, okay, so this is a card, I'm looking at a card, I like this element in it, which is description. So I will take that thing description and apply it to any other context, situation, organization that I'm in, and try it out if it plays with that. Or I say, I'm looking at this thing, and I'm looking at a tennis racket over here. Let me just see if I can find an Oxel out of this. Like wrapping or so, because it's like this. It's a bit rotten, that one. So like, and then I say, okay, so can I take the idea of wrapping as an organizational element? So I make an Oxel of that, and then I say, okay, so how can I apply that to a particular situation or organization or process that I want to be organizing? So I use that as an Oxel, as an element of that organization. Yeah. That's how I kind of would define that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is in a way like a kind of essential question, although it's funny to say because it kind of doesn't work from essences, but it's also a big can of worms. But the key thing is, once you move into this kind of a space, like you cannot rely on kind of like this sort of strict separation. Like concepts never were really strictly separated from each other. We do a lot of work to separate them, but they tend to blend into each other, as we see even from dictionaries. Like, but the key thing then becomes like a shift of perspective. It's not so much about what it is, but it's about what it does. So what is the kind of impetus for Oxel? Of course, we can change this, but to put it as a kind of like a guide light, like a lighthouse, is that it is instrumentalization towards being able to reorganize culture in this sort of compositional edit mode form. So this is why I often return to this. I should have other examples, but this simple example, if I make a short little text of saying reading and then saying reading is a form of a puzzle using text, and then have like that, for example, that you take a certain block of text that you can define yourself, and you look at it as a whole, and you're facing this, that you have to rewrite it. And then like stopping there and thinking what happens is like potentially that silly little thing has reorganized every text if I follow it. If I take to heart that this is what I was supposed to do with texts, every text in the world is reorganized. And that's the impetus, to be able to do that, and having instrumentalization and structure to support that. And that's much more of a guiding light of what, rather than what it is, its form and how does it look like. It's more about what it does than what it is.
Yeah, I think then we might be able to say that yeah, because I think I've been conceptualizing cards more on the side of like the Oxel, but that a card is just like another signifier that we put on top of Oxel, like that allows us to more easily visualize possible operations.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. Like there is overlap certainly, but like card makes you think about this sort of possibilities. For example, what card emphasizes, at least for me, this can be different for you, but is this sort of system inside, system outside, and actually forming an interface between those two things, which is like actually something that reflected in all of our cards. I mean, it's been a topic, but I think all of us came to that in very different ways. And that's something that is closer to you when you start from the guiding point of the card, and that this can be useful. But like in this sense, like even the card is about what it does, but it does, wouldn't even say slightly, I would say significantly different things than the Oxel does. Of course, the Oxel card is an existing concept, Oxel isn't, but coming back to this, that the Oxel is about reorganizing culture and being able to be equipped with that possibility, to be able to support a person to do that
in a way that might not necessarily be this inside-outside relation.
Yeah, can be that, but can be many other ways.
Okay,
many
so
of them yet unconceived. But that's kind of like the litmus test. Is it like helping on this?
Okay. All right, because I've been having trouble using this this oxel word. I was on a call a while ago where we talked about it, but I haven't really thought about it for a long time. So, but yeah, I guess.
No, it's a good question, because it also kind of, it takes us to a point where we cannot avoid the kind of difficulty that comes from a different paradigm of defining which is what it does rather than what it is. That's not to say that much of our existing definitions would also have like combining these two elements, but it often starts from this guiding operation that I have to tell what it is, which comes up with a host of problems. Like this relates back to an earlier conversation where Leah was present, where you had the definition of the paragraph. And I told, like, much of my academic years, or there was a period there where I visited the cultures of definition and how those things have an operational quality that brings things into it. So like well, that's a little bit of a sidetrack, but coming back, like that, in a way, like definition often has this sort of guideline that I have to tell what it is, and that in itself often does damage to the different what is defining in itself. And now if you change that paradigm that I have to tell what it does, it starts to recalibrate, reconfigure how you think about definition. And at the Oxel point, it's hard to avoid that, which is a kind of a big change in the background.
It is the evental. It is an oxel is an event that organizes the constellation of meaning and reference and relation, and that can happen in an infinite number of ways, and the card and its affordances give us certain operations that come to mind, like repositioning, right, nesting, these other things, but there can be more. We just have to discover them.
That's still defining what is. I have a practical example. I just thought of a practical example which gives maybe a good like concretization. How do you define chess? Well, you can go to a Wikipedia page which tells about the history and how it looks and so on, which is what it is defined. But if you really want to define chess, that's not helping the person so much to play with it. Actually, the best way to define chess as chess is to give the rules for it. Like to understand the operations, that is what chess does. So the rules of chess is a definition of chess. In some ways, it's much more, quote unquote, essentialist definition of chess, but it's a different quality. So in a way, like all of this, which might seem hoity-toity, like high-minded, whatever, is actually not that different from like just moving like to this point of how do you define a game as a game, you have to define what it does. So like in this way, it's not so exotic jump. It's just taking this that has been happening for a while, that for defining a game there, you have these two different cultures, which are kind of defining what the game is, like a Wikipedia page, which are kind of not actually defining the game for you. And then you have this other way, which is actually much more substantial for the game, which is like, how does it play, what it does, which is another way of defining a game, much more functional and pragmatic. And this is just embracing that culture as definition, because it is. So in this way, like when I'm saying Oxel is this, I'm kind of doing the same thing. This is how it should play. And I'm not, of course, forcing that. That's still up to negotiation, should it play differently. But the key things, the key qualities I was describing was more towards how it plays. It plays by enabling reorganization of culture and expressing that, and therefore sharing that, which then becomes a way to position yourself differently in culture, because you decide to adopt this oxel. Now you do reading differently, or question marks differently, or anything, because any convention can be changed. Allowing this play is what oxels should do. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, that was really good. I think, yeah, just to conceptualize oxels as any, like the scope of the oxel can be any, right? Like a nation state is an oxel in its organizing capacity.
Yes.
But also specific bureaucratic form, like even just an input field in a website is an oxel.
Yes.
So the scale really varies a lot. And the cards, what it allows is to bring all of that scale to a level where they are compatible, right? You can play an oxel that is the nation state, and then the oxel that is the input field, and they might have the same relevance, even if their scale is widely different.
So we're talking about the oxelness of a something, where that something. So then, yeah, this goes back to the a card is an interface. Card is an interface for performing an oxel.
Yes, and to agreed on that, and also Pablo's points, and to make another concrete example. This is kind of a situation where, let's say there is a board game designer, and they're thinking of a certain kind of mechanic, how the game plays, and then they're thinking, well, I could maybe use cards for this. Should I put this operation, this play behavior in the form of cards? That's the kind of question of oxel relation to cards. And of course, the cards, especially how we've been looking at them, are quite, I think, alluring, or hold a lot of potential for oxel description. I don't think, like, just like actually the expression of a game doesn't have like a shackle that it has to be in a particular medium. And this is actually true of all games. We've talked about this earlier, but just like, you know, you're playing the chess in a physical board in a outside environment, and it starts to rain, and then you take a picture and you move it on a digital screen. Completely normal activity, but we just changed the medium because the medium wasn't essential for the game, because it's what it does rather than what it is. All of these things actually cohere together. So, so this area, while we are doing this, we're doing this in a kind of cognitive dissonance of sometimes not like taking a step back and stop and wait a minute, there's two different cultures of definition here. Martin, you're muted. Or you're saying in the house?
I was just speaking with Rosa, but I said to Rosa that I also will now stop because we're kind of having dinner.
Yeah.
But this was good to kind of maybe wrap up on that, or like come back around on the Oxel part. I thought that was maybe good at this point where we've been on the card and everything, so with so much attention. I think I might need to make a bit of a hard cut now. But
Yeah, I mean, we've been here quite a bit, but like you can certainly do the hard cut, and that's completely okay. But maybe we could bring some points of closure for the rest of us while Martin gets some food. But I do think like, yeah, like that's the point. Like the card in itself has its own, call it independent sovereignty, or at least a starting point. As does Oxel, it has its own independent sovereignty or its own starting point. But these have relations. And for this sort of quality of Oxels, which, by the way, everything I described was for me also proof in the pudding of this quality of being able to recompose culture and its conventions. This is why I was so elated by what happened after I started draft playing it, because it was doing what it was supposed to be doing. It was playing in the way it was supposed to play. But now then comes this question of, but how do you express this play to others? How do you share it? And in one way, it's a very simple question, at least at the start. Like said, like you could make the speculative symbols. Like, okay, here's an operation of what to do, like what it does. Here's some examples, which are forms in themselves that also support understanding of how to do them by being examples in this sense. But that opens this, that yes, there's some text and there's some pictures and there's something else, like all of that can be there. But that's a very wide field. So what it would be an interesting way of expressing it, and how could the card could help? And then the one way, like very crude but possible way of thinking of how every card is a deck and how every deck is a card, almost like a deck with a card on top glued, is one way to start to think something in a manner that Oxels would want to behave. But it's just a starting point. I think a workable starting point, but still a bit crude.
I have a practical suggestion that could be fun to explore, like just as you did with the for next session, by the way, not now.
Yes, good.
Just as you did now with the questions, which I think was an operation of turning the question into an oxel and then just like amplifying that oxel and deriving different oxels from it. That we could try to do the same thing as an exercise. Like
Yes.
each of us brings like a small gesture that was like conceptualized in an oxel way and opened up in the same way you did with questions. That could be an interesting exercise just to reaffirm the oxel definition and to continue with this figural opening of conventions.
I think that's a good one. What do the others think? Because this is a collective exercise. Towards supporting that, the one thing practically I could do, I was thinking, like in Telegram, now we have these topics, but we haven't used because we still have just the general topic. I was thinking of opening two topics. One being card, one being oxel. Of course, more can be opened later, but that, and this could be a way, for example, in the oxel, I could post these and like some stuff on the other experiments I've done, because I mean, you don't have to follow anything there, but maybe it's helpful for people to think, to have some material on that. And we could utilize that Telegram group to be this, or Telegram topic subgroup, to be like a way to have that discussion there. Does that make sense? Because it also, I think it complements the main group, that it has this sort of development areas, and like there certainly can be others, but having the oxel and the card kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I do like that. I feel that I feel that it is a good idea.
I agree. It also helps in the whatever definitions we might produce, if we all tap in with different inputs, it's all there. It's not spread across many conversations we had. I think it's a good plan.
Yeah, that's also a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Because we had the Discord and we just dropped it, didn't we, at the end? So it's just it's much better the Telegram. It's much more immediate. I feel like it makes more sense if we do it in the Telegram.
Yeah, I mean, we're already there, so.
Discord. Yeah, because we had Discord, you know, with all these plans, but then it's not really flying. So I think the Telegram is much better at the end.
I kind of take a very no stress approach about this. We might at some point move to Discord if it naturally happens.
Yeah.
And this time it didn't happen. Like, that doesn't preclude that it could happen in the future. Of course, the benefit of Telegram is that there are other people who are following it, and it's very unlikely that all of them would follow to the Discord. And like, there have been people jumping in from them, including Linda. Like it's the positive outcomes that have come from the presence of Linda are partly that you were following the group, even if you were not active. If you move to Discord, some of these people might be lost.
Yeah.
But like, it's not like this is a final say. Like, we can later, if we move, think about saving things. But now that it exists and there is these topics, we could use this and see what happens. If they don't work, no sweat. Then we do something else. It's about like starting gardens and see if they grow.
Cool beans, guys. Cool beans.
Sounds good. I will
All right.
also have to go.
Yes.
Same. Good to see you all. It was fun today. Yet again, lots of things to think about. I like this relationship and thinking about the symbolism. I feel like there's a lot there. If you think about the canon as well, sort of established notion, and how can you just push that? I think there's lots of there's quite of an interesting. Yeah, I'm just thinking whilst I'm talking, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see this effect that actually starting to think in a different way infects you, which was like quality I was hoping for. But like this is why I wanted to have the second day example in all its weirdness. But the weirdness is the result of the infection of actually starting to think about things differently in a fairly deep way differently, which is stark in its effect. But yeah, let's do that. Like, okay, the next session is finding, even if you have the starting point of thing I would like to oxelize or thing I think would like to oxelize, and here's some ideas towards it, that's enough. But to support this development, I can start the two Telegram topics, card and oxel, and I'll post to the oxel topic like descriptions of this, what we went through today, because I've written some of it down. That's easy, but I'll try to do also others. Just as supportive material, you don't have to follow them in any kind of faithfulness when you're thinking of your own.
It would be cool, generally speaking, if we're going down this card Oxel Telegram route thing, right? Like if these different activities that we're proposing, right? Like creating symbols and exploring them, like creating like Telegram channel thing where we can just paste a symbol every now and then or something.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there is a whole lot of like the sort of growth possibilities are interesting. Like, you know, you could even make a Twitter handle, give all of us rights, and just post symbols in there, and then short descriptions, and like whatever. It's like it's a potential approach, and this is an interesting area to think about how to become present in the world, which might be useful. So it's a rich soil to think about. like what if there is a Telegram channel which is something like the existent unexistent culture of the question, and then it just posts a new question, and but that's just one thing because it's one pocket. You know, we don't have to do it, but it's a possibility. But with that, I will now. Anybody have any wiser words than my practical points at the end? I'm stopping the recording in a second. Who has to? Does anybody have a key word? Words. Sorry, no. That's all you get.